Hello, and welcome to today's Gartner webinar, Disrupting Traditional Approaches to Create a Resilient Innovation Funding Model. I'm Danielle Williams, your moderator for this session. Before we get started, I have a few tips to help enhance your webinar experience. Below the presentation view, you'll see tabs you can use. We want to hear from you. Click Ask a Question to submit your questions and comments at any time. To access your copy of the research slides and other helpful resources, click the Attachments tab. This webinar is being recorded. Watch this presentation again and find more great insights on demand at gartner.com/webinars. Now, I'd like to welcome Gartner's Senior Director Analyst, Michelle Bazargan. Michelle, thank you for joining us, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. I hope everyone is doing well, staying safe and healthy. If you are on this call, you obviously know the importance of innovation. And even though we have an uncontrollable force around us, there is a controllable force, which is to keep creativity alive, not to just get us through the crisis, but really beyond. So for some organizations, near-term survival is understandably the only agenda item, but many are very laser focused on scenario planning for this uncertainty and thinking about how to position themselves once the crisis has passed and what the new normal might look like. And innovation is a critical strategy to enable this as enterprises try to figure out how to respond and develop new value and create new value around whether it's their products or their delivery. And so, depending on if we end up staying home, if it's going to be a hybrid model, what these scenarios might look like as we start to return back to the new normal. So today I'm going to take you through one foundational area behind enabling innovation, which is disrupting traditional funding models and approaches. There's many factors that we cover here at Gartner, tied to operating models, metrics, skills, the list goes on. But this is one of the foundational areas as well that we'll focus on. So for other areas, we certainly have other research that can help you on building out the entire thing. And it won't be a one-size-fits-all, just like with anything. This is going to be foundational areas for you to look at to figure out how to help build a resilient model that will work for your organization. So let's look at some of the traditions that sometimes get us stuck and the root of these traditions. Many have heard that we're in the fourth industrial revolution that's been primarily driven by technology. Yet a lot of our organizational structures and processes unfortunately haven't evolved since the Industrial Revolution. And guess what the Industrial Revolution was set up for? It was set up for assembly line efficiency, to reduce operational risk. It was never necessarily set up to drive innovation. And what's happened is a lot of our leadership styles, a lot of our incentives, rewards, even habits have not really evolved as quickly as some of the other things have. And it's an opportunity to look at all of these various structures, processes, models, with funding obviously is one of them, but there's many of them, and really figure out how to align it. So a lot of our strategies and PowerPoint say the word, we need to be innovative, we need to transform, and all the buzzwords you can think of, but then our action structures, process, and behaviors don't always necessarily align. And in simple terms, what that can look like is having aspirations to want to run a marathon, but none of your habits like training and eating right are aligned with that. So then oftentimes it becomes a struggle and a little bit more of a dream. And the answer isn't necessarily always to just acquire a startup since they're innovative, because then what do? You wrap them into these outdated processes and it's not really a sustainable model. So the results on our stuckness really show. We ran a survey to kind of look at some of these behaviors and habits and see how they align with the aspirations of driving innovation or transformation. And the results came back pretty aligned with people are focused on immediate goals, and funding became one of the top challenges also identified, whether it was executives not supporting innovation funding or, there just wasn't any funding available. So the conflict is there are traditional investment management approaches that we've all lived through, really, the annual budgeting process, the capital project management process, having to present formal business cases that, innovation business cases are not going to be the same as some operational business cases. So a lot of our process, including the financial aspect, are really failing to meet the speed of change. And so we have to figure out some of these conflicts and resolve them. The other conflict we have is our micro focus on what's happening right now, right? So a lot of our structures, our command and control organizational structures or processes or KPIs are what I call have a lot of blockbuster syndrome, blockbuster video syndrome. And that was that they're laser, Blockbuster was laser focused on their day-to-day. They were very focused on immediate quarter profits, immediate annual profits. Their metrics were all laser focused on the micro side. And so they didn't really look at the macro lens of what new technologies are on the market, how are consumer behaviors changing. And we all kind of know how that story ended. They weren't able to be resilient. The other major collision course that we're on is pace, as we all know, and how fast we respond. So back in the day, we all had the luxury of time. If you look at back into the automotive industry, it took them 62 years to hit 50 million drivers, but it took Facebook only 3 years to hit 50 million users. So the pace is crazy, and it was 10x before, and most likely coming out of the crisis, it's going to be 100x. So we have to shift our mindset of being focused on what's happening now to the future. And one of them is, getting out of the denial habit of the odds of things happening are low. The odds of us getting disrupted in our industry are low. The odds of being faced with a pandemic, a global pandemic, are low. And instead shifting our mindset to preparation. What do scenarios look like? The other thing is getting really serious about agility and, getting out of the mindset that agile isn't this process that product people do. It's a process about being nimble and having speed and being efficient and doing it better. It's not just a technology product development thing. The other thing is to, align our behaviors. Now more than ever, you can't say, well, we need to be innovative, but then your behavior and your day-to-day behavior doesn't match that. So for example, you might say we need to transform, we need to be innovative, but then when people get into meetings, the behaviors don't show that, or what you measure people with don't show that. And right now is even more crucial because people are very sensitive to trust. And so you can't make these statements, but then not have your behaviors and things you do aligned with it. The other big thing is to balance your KPIs and metrics. So a lot of times we get laser focused on the now. We get focused on operational metrics, right? Especially in tech. You have to have 99% uptime, on time, on budget. All of those are micro-focused type KPIs. They're not focused on the future and the innovation. So we have to aggressively look at those things and change our mindsets to be balanced. And we have to keep these macro balanced focus and perspective even while we're in a crisis, because a totally natural knee-jerk reaction, and as tempting as it is, well, we can just cancel innovation or shelf it or just keep doing what you're doing until we figure out what the market does. And that can definitely negatively impact the long-term livelihood of an organization. So it's very vital to start having these conversations about what are proper scenarios for your business and your industry, and figuring out ways to experiment some of these new scenarios to make sure that you are proactive coming out of COVID instead of reactive to whatever the market does. And although it's not an exact comparison to what we're going through today, history has definitely demonstrated that consumers and businesses will look for more cost-effective, faster, and creative products and services when you come out of a downturn. And oftentimes scarcity and constraints will lead to an urgency to create new things. For example, back in 08-09, the financial crisis caused a reduction in income. And so the need for cheaper housing and sharing transportation is what gave birth to the shared economy. Back then, nobody knew that sharing behavior would actually be something that would stick. And now these companies are even being disrupted as we shift to more of a stay-home economy, and they're trying to pivot to accommodate whether it's Uber delivering tests and things, or Airbnb figuring out how to stamp a home that has been professionally cleaned and things like that. Another great example that's closer is China's Alibaba emerged from the 2002-03 SARS epidemic in a similar fashion. And it was similar to COVID, even though it was contained to China. Retail stores were closed, people were working from home, there was travel restrictions. So the Alibaba platform actually became the primary source to connect U.S. buyers to Chinese suppliers during this time of crisis. So today, we're going to talk about some of the key challenges that we see that may sound simple, but they're really foundational in ensuring you're moving away from your traditional investment management approaches when it comes to innovation, your annual budgeting, the capital project management, the formal business cases. And these are kind of foundational challenges we see that I'll take you through a little bit later on what to do about them. But it's really foundational to figure out how do we create a flexible, resilient model to innovate and stay relevant. And depending on your organization's industry, your size, your culture, your maturity, you're going to see different things. But some of the key challenges that people have is executive partnerships. So a lot of times when you get innovation funding, whether it's the CIO or the innovation leader, they kind of go off on their own after they've, let's say, one time gotten the funding and try to do things on their own instead of engaging, for example, the CFO on a continuous basis. The other thing is making innovation everybody's job. So that's kind of a challenge where organizations that don't have a disciplined approach, because that creates silos. And sometimes you'll duplicate capabilities, you'll duplicate tools, you'll lose visibility on what it is that you're actually even innovating. And then the other thing is, organizations are really risk adverse. So they'll take traditional approaches. They'll take the same approach that they take for running the operational side of the house with capital budgeting and business case metrics that are often lengthy or once a year. And they'll try to copy that same method for innovation. And that's the opposite. So there's a process clash where innovation or product processes are super nimble and agile, but then they're going against funding processes that haven't been changed for years. So how do we create flexibility and alignment and enable one another and determine a custom way that works for your organization? And the first step to doing all of this is getting very, very clear on your goals. It can't be, let's allocate 5% to innovation, and just be done with it. It can't be, well, the industry average is 5 million, so let's just allocate that. It has to be more around asking better questions on why you're innovating. What is the market doing? How are we going to respond? And starting there. And, now is a really great time to even do, soul searching because of COVID. So many things have changed. We often ask our kids, what do you want to do when you grow up? And it's sort of similar. It's really doing soul searching to say, why do we do what we do? And getting out of the habit of when you ask most people, what is it that you do or what is it that your company does, they really get stuck on the how instead of the why. They'll say, we sell cars, we sell shoes, we sell apparel, or so forth. And so taking the time to really think about what it is that we really do. What is our compelling why? And there's a ton of examples. These are a few, but Tony Hsieh, who created Zappos that was acquired by Amazon, he never saw it as they sell shoes. He actually stepped back and said, what we really strive to do is to deliver happiness. And so they laser focused on their top customer, which was women. And for those of us that have sisters, daughters, and wives, we know that shoes make women pretty happy. So he actually reinvented how we purchase shoes online and solved the biggest experience issue, which was around returns. And again, they didn't focus on the shoe, they focused on what they were changing within the experience. Lululemon is another one. They don't just sell yoga pants, they're actually extremely involved in the community. They're looking to improve people's lives and improve their health, and they literally do this one city at a time. So really taking a step back before you leap forward and think about what it is that you're innovating. And right now is a great time to think about the market dynamics. This should be ongoing. We shouldn't wait for a crisis to think about market dynamics or business goals. We shouldn't make it a one-year event. because of the pace of disruption, this needs to be an almost quarterly practice. But right now is a great time, after asking what it is that you really do, to step back and say, what's going on in the market? You know, is there, beyond the crisis, what's going to change? And ongoing, are there certain things within our industry that may change? Is the remote worker aspect going to cause us to do things differently? Is there generational demands that might change? You know, this generation is now going through COVID. Coming out of it, are there trust issues or trust challenges that we're going to be faced with continuously? So starting there, then getting laser focused on your business goals, and then aligning them to your innovation goals. So it's really important to kind of step back and then use all of these three pillars to leap forward and to think about all the various scenarios that could happen. And if you do this type of alignment, this is often what it can look like. So this is an example of market alignment, business goal alignment, along with the innovation. So before they funded anything, they really thought through what was going on in the market at the time. And Autoliv is an automotive safety supplier, and they were having, many manufacturers were having recall issues. So they took a market challenge that was happening. They laser focused the innovation team on it. That's how they funded it. The campaign was very compelling. It had a why. It was, you know, not to introduce some sort of technology or chatbots or AI. It was compelling. It was to save customers' lives. And so as a result, they were able to get 1,500 ideas. They provided funding, and they ended up launching, as a result of this, a brand new revenue generating product line. So this can be evolving. It doesn't necessarily have to be surrounded around COVID. It could have to do with recalls. It could have to do with specific industry challenges that are going on. Another example is, you know, Amazon. They wanted to increase customer loyalty. So they laser focused their business goal and innovation goal around that. They were very clear that they wanted to inspire their teams to figure out, how do we improve this program? It actually wasn't necessarily even driven around, you know, we want to enable AI. It wasn't like that. It was a business aligned goal. And the result is the tool that many of us are probably using at home today, which is the Amazon Prime product that is a major revenue generator for Amazon. So let's get into some of the recommendations so that, you know, we can all start to see innovation as an opportunity to grow, not necessarily a risk to mitigate, and be real conscious about it, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in the mitigation of things, because that's how the operational side of the house of many of our organizations work. And really to remember that innovation and creativity is what distinguishes a leader from a follower, and having the courage to change a lot of the things that are going on, to have the courage as a leader to step back and say, we need to look at our why. We need to look at the way that, you know, what we want to do when we grow up coming out of this kind of factor, and really reinventing some of the foundational structures that would do that. So let's get into how do you do that specifically from a funding perspective. And it may sound basic, but the first thing is to aggressively partner with your CFO and the finance team, and to drive some ownership and accountability, instead of they're just the people that you go and get money from and, you know, see them in a year from now. And it's to work together to drive new adaptive funding approaches for innovation, and for the finance leadership team to be involved in the strategy. And the CFO can play a critical role in establishing flexible approaches, especially that work for your organization, that will always differ depending on where you're at, what your maturity model is. And they can also you know, help with removing any roadblocks, if there are any, to experiment. So if you involve them through the entire life cycle, and they know that they're playing a contributor role, they can help with resource constraints, because keep in mind, the CFO usually knows where things are going on within the organization. So if you have a barrier, maybe he has visibility into a resource that can be pulled from an initiative that isn't as important, and bring them onto the innovation team. And this is a little bit how the VC model works, right? So venture capitalists, they don't have, you know, the CFO is involved in the decision making. They're actually involved in every stage of a startup and how they come to life. And this can be similar way can be duplicated within a large corporation, and leveraging one another's business and technology knowledge to bring this together. The other thing too is the CFO can help with your ecosystem. So one way to accelerate innovation is to have a broad ecosystem of your partners or other relationships like with schools and such. And so he can help with, if you already, let's say, have an existing vendor relationship and they're only delivering tactical operational things, well, when it's time to renegotiate their contract, you could have innovation baked into the contract. And that's where the CFO can help kind of think about some of those things instead of trying to do it on your own. The other aspect is to fund innovation capabilities separately, the core ones, the foundational ones. So if you say, innovation is everyone's job, oftentimes it'll create a silo and people will try to go off and figure out the main tools that they need that everybody can use. And so oftentimes some of the core capabilities, just like any service that you offer, can be foundational, and establishing some of the funding sources can depend on each company and the extent of your experiments. So for example, Amazon spent millions developing their own drone delivery technology, while UPS decided that they were going to partner with established drone makers. So when you make decisions like that with your CFO, that is also going to decide how much money that you need to spend, because your ecosystem is going to have a big part to do with it. So one option is funding can be allocated from a central fund, or if the innovation ties specifically to a business unit, it can also come from that team's budget. And centrally funded innovation can often be run as like a corporate lab that almost functions as a separate business unit or as a separate entity. And there's tons of examples on the market. They even have their own P&L and so forth. Like Johnson & Johnson has their own labs, AT&T has their own labs, Lowe's has a separate innovation lab, and it runs like its own entity. The other option that you can decide works better for you is some organizations create a centralized innovation resource and capability, almost like a shared service, just like you do other shared services within the organization. And they'll invest in the foundational capabilities that everyone in the organization can leverage. And these services aim to encourage distributed innovation and reduce the duplication of common resources. And funding for the shared innovation services is typically allocated out of an enterprise budget. And these capabilities can be run similar to other shared service groups and include services such as an innovation, identifying key roles, like an innovation manager can help service any experiment that's going on, a design thinking expert. Collaboration can be funded. So, many people can use a physical lab, which now, is virtual, but you can use the same collaborative tool, or innovation management software can be, made as one investment that everybody can run certain campaigns off of. Or if you're doing, training, a lot of times instead of having flat training classes, you can shift the spend into this foundational capability where, you're training people on specific innovation principles, so everybody's talking the same language. You're training people on how to do design thinking, and then how to execute their efforts, and so on. And so this can also be implemented in a phased approach as shown on this illustration, or you could do things in parallel as well to get this done. And then this capability model is set up similar to like startup incubation and innovation accelerators like Techstars, Founders Institute. So what they do is they usually provide the startup with foundational resources and capabilities on how to grow their startup, but then each startup is responsible for funding their own experiments and their own development. So this is something similar. And then business units can each fund their own experiment depending on what they're doing. So if you have 4 business units, and one knows that they need to disrupt themselves and come up with products and services, they can fund specific innovation that has to do with that. Or if you have a business unit that really doesn't think there's much disruption going on and it's really more around incremental innovation, then they can choose to fund their pieces out of that. Or, if they want to shift operational spend and they want to reinvest it into innovation, it gives the flexibility depending on what their innovation is. And some of this can all be duplicated to a virtual environment. You know, a lot of labs were focused on a physical presence, but obviously with COVID, everyone has shifted, and there's tons of tools on the market that Gartner researches that can enable a lot of like virtual design thinking sessions and things like that. So shifting this to a virtual model is also not as difficult. So here's an example of Starbucks that actually does similar this funding of the foundational aspects, you know, so they have their tools, their people that facilitate various ideas that come in and out. So this is a screenshot of their campaign portal. They're very focused on, you know, what are some of the new products we can introduce? How can we change our experience? And people submit ideas, but behind the scenes, they have foundational capabilities that I just reviewed with the chart that enable all of this. And then depending on the idea that comes in and the amount of votes that it receives, that's how they determine what they want to fund beyond the foundational investment that they've made. In addition, CIOs or innovation leaders can also work with their CFOs to define an innovation portfolio that's tied to the funding and investment principles for various types. And as I mentioned before, there's different dimensions, right? Depending on your industry, your company, depending on even the business unit. You know, you may want to be focused on incremental innovation, which, you know, requires a different set of funding versus radical and game-changing. You may want to be focused completely on internal efficiency, right? It could be either cost optimization that is shifted into innovation investments. Some companies will even freeze enhancements or fixes on operational systems that they know are going to be, you know, for example, sunsetted, and then they'll shift the enhancement spend to figuring out, you know, incremental innovation. So there's many different ways you can do it, but having these like 4 buckets and capabilities identified that meet your needs is important. And then obviously, just like any portfolio, this needs to be evaluated continuously and shifted depending on what's going on, just like you would do with an investment portfolio. So here's one example of BMW. They actually have shifted their innovation portfolio into a cost optimization example. So they had a need at the time to identify some cost savings, and they wanted to reinvest it into some of their innovation. So they actually used the innovation community and platform to do this. And laser focused on, you know, we want the ideas to be primarily around cost savings, and we'll go from there. And they were able to collect 8,000 ideas and realize a $43 million cost savings just in the first year. And so not only did they leverage this capability behind the scenes of, you know, an investment that they made, but they also took that capability to meet a immediate business driver. And what they did effectively was create a community around this. And this can oftentimes, especially right now, not only achieve the cost saving goals to identify to potentially reinvest into innovation, but it's great for these communities to come together and people to come together to boost morale, especially during challenging times, because they're all together contributing to a greater cause. It's laser focused. It's not just a general, you know, submit innovation ideas, and it really creates focus to get the results that you're looking for. So time-sensitive innovation opportunities can often be delayed or abandoned because, you know, you're asking people to go through the traditional investment management approaches. So they might look at it and say, oh my God, by the time I explain this, you know, experiment, money that I need for this experiment, you know, I can't justify it in the way that things are set up right now, because innovation and product development is oftentimes very iterative, lean, and so it doesn't align with the way traditional models may look. And so a lot of times what you can do, again, building on partnering with the CFO, figuring out your portfolio, the next thing would be to figure out a way that would work for your organization. And so, for example, you could form a council that includes if you're an innovation leader, the CIO, the CFO, and maybe another major key stakeholder. and figure out, okay, this is how we execute on innovation. We have a design thinking method, we have a lean iterative approach, and then we get into experiments. So should we have major funding decisions at each of those stages? And again, this is a little bit similar to the way venture capital works, right? So have they gotten traction? Does this still make sense? Does the market still make sense? And that's why it's important to involve other executives and your CFO to constantly assess if the next stage of investment still makes sense and if the results are what you're looking for. So creating almost a light, flexible process around this, that at each stage you can pivot and figure out, you know, now, for example, COVID is going on, so now we want to pivot and experiment some of the business scenarios that we think are gonna happen. And what you can do is form an innovation council that can oftentimes, you know, decide some of these things. And it's obviously important beforehand to make sure that this council is an enabler, so it's not necessarily set up that someone, you know, is not familiar with innovation or an executive that's going to come in and poke holes. It's really to help remove barriers, get people focused on things that are the right things that are aligned for the organization. And the other aspect too is to make sure that whatever's being created is not necessarily just purely technology focused. So there's a balance there where you're constantly keeping in mind, you know, the customer problem and aligning it with the toolbox that you might have of how to fix that. The other thing too, that if you form a council or you kind of keep yourself balanced, that can, you know, be accomplished, is a lot of times we have a habit, especially as technologists, and ex-technologists, you might think that, you know, some form of technology is always a solution, a brand new shiny object, and that's not always the case. And if you involve more business leaders within the process, you can think about those things. So Groupon is a great example. When they first came to life, they actually didn't create anything brand new, new technology shiny. They used an existing platform, which was email, and they just simply emailed coupons to their set of customers. And so that gave them, there was no fancy technology, no database, no like shiny, pretty UI. It was just something that was very simple to prove out a concept. The cost was super low, and they got the feedback that they needed, and they pivoted quickly to what they needed. And so especially right now, reducing perfection needs to be something that's fresh on the mind. It doesn't always have to be something new. It can be something that's existing that you're not even spending that much money on, but you're moving along the process. So more than ever, organizations are struggling to keep up with their competitors and changes and all the things that are going on around us. So really, the key things to do is to avoid some of these knee-jerk reactions or having a macro lens of only dealing with what's happening in front of you and not keeping perspective of the future, and making sure that you're fixing the foundational challenges, really thinking through the behaviors of your organization as far as KPIs and metrics and how to change all that. And making sure and to have a solid partnership with your CFO and the finance team to really create what's going to work for your organization by developing a flexible, resilient model that meets your unique needs, depending on your industry, your size, your culture, and then establishing or refocusing funding for some of these core capabilities. If you don't have one, establishing that. If, you know, it's all over the place, bringing it back in. And then continuously, the other key is to continuously work together to realign and evaluate and adjust your portfolio. Definitely the portfolios have to be adjusted right now with COVID, but if you think about it, there's always things going on around us that would meet the need of this continuous flexibility to change what you're working on. And then recognize really that scarcity is a good thing, and innovation is an opportunity to grow, not really a risk that needs to be mitigated. And, you know, keep in mind, again, that innovation distinguishes the leader from the follower, and it's about courage. And innovation means, and creativity means you have this macro lens on and you're not getting sucked into the day-to-day. And if done properly, it'll set up your organization not only to get through what's happening right now, but to thrive continuously in a disruptive market that's going to continue to be fast, and we're going to continue to need these basic processes to not only respond to crises, but also the future.
Thank you, Michelle. Please submit your questions and comments in the Ask a Question tab. Before we get to the Q&A, here are some resources to take you deeper into the topic. You can view more resources to get more insights on how to lead your organization's COVID-19 response and recovery with our complimentary research and tools. Get more Gartner insights. Download the research slides, view upcoming and on-demand webinars at gartner.com/IT-webinars, and rate this webinar. A 5 is the top rating. Click Rate This and send rating to submit your response. Okay, Michelle, over to you to address questions.
Okay, let's see. There's a question, a little off topic, but as far as lacking the skill sets for effective innovation, we actually have broad research around this area. And one thing to keep in mind when it comes to skills is a lot of companies feel that they have to create everything internally. And so skills, especially now with COVID, it's really about your ecosystem and shared intelligence. It's no longer about the intelligence that's just within an organization. We can all see in the news some of the co-creation that's even happening amongst even competitors to try to get to a vaccine or get to a solution. So the skills aspect, you know, the answer is not always to just hire more people, right? It's to get creative about how your innovation ecosystem can work. So sometimes you'll just hire the core foundational roles you need, such as an innovation manager, but then, you know, both from a cost perspective, you'll have a fluid ecosystem model where you're pulling other resources, whether it's vendors or partners, it can be schools or universities, it can be working with startups and accelerators. And so sometimes skills is very focused on what's happening and we have to do everything ourselves and hire the right people, and where it's headed is more of a shared intelligence co-creation model. Let's see. There's a question, I think the skills conversation sparked this one, as far as what do you think is the COVID impact on personality shifting? So I definitely think that, and we've identified this at Gartner, there is going to be a trust element that's going to be happening where, you know, this is sort of why I hit on the whole authenticity earlier, where, for example, if you're saying you want to be innovative or you say whatever it is that you want to do, if you're not showing up as that, I think the tolerance for that is going to be a lot lower. So it's very dangerous to say, you know, we want to be innovative, but we're only going to give you 4 hours on Friday to innovate. That's a conflict. And I think the tolerance of that is going to be a lot lower coming out of COVID. And then obviously the big remote working experiment has shown to be successful. So that's going to now turn into an expectation. And so the shift to doing innovation in a virtual setting where you can, obviously there's some companies that produce physical products, so it's a little bit harder, but the virtual expectation shift is going to be there. And the good thing about that is now you can gain access to a global workforce. You're no longer limited to a certain location. And so some of those things are going to shift as far as what people are expecting and wanting to do. Let's see. So this is a great question. One of the earlier slides, I mentioned how Agile is just not a product thing. I constantly hear Agile is just for IT, and I'm sold on Agile needs to be part of everything. But how do you advise and convert the naysayers? Well, definitely the time is now. I would take advantage of what's going on around us and really getting the leadership team to recognize how things are definitely going to pivot. And the organizational structure and the things that we do are no longer going to meet the needs of where we need to be. So I would evangelize and share some of the stories that history has shown and really start thinking about, you know, how does communication and data actually flow in your company? So how do you, silos is the biggest factor to this, right? So traditionally, we will create departments off of org charts, and that's what creates silos, right? So getting really explicit about, you know, why would we do that where it creates, you know, let's say 3 days to get something done when people can come together, which is sort of the, you know, a light definition of agile, and we can be much more nimble. You know, let's look at how these teams come together. And I would use stories and use stories about, you know, the previous downturns, and then, you know, evangelize coming out of this, how it's critical for your organization to really do things differently. And at the end of the day, the leaders in your organizations have to recognize that. So if they don't even recognize that they have to do something different, then, you know, that's a flag, because you know, majority of leaders are recognizing that the way that they used to do something is not the same way. And part of it could be people are shy of the term agile because it has been such a, you know, buzzword for product management. So maybe explaining, you know, what agile really is and what being nimble really is, and that it's not necessarily a technology definition. So I think sometimes people will shy away from that because, you know, there's not a clear business definition out there, so you're going to have to identify that. Okay, let's see. There's a question about innovation management software. There's a lot that we do here at Gartner. We do a lot of research around that and within our quadrants. But there are some that we identified: Bright Idea, Idea Scale. Those are some of the market leaders. They enable a lot of some of the things that I spoke about in some of the examples that I showed today. But we also have additional research that shows you the pros and cons and capabilities of each of those. But some of those are on the market as well. Let's see here. We have a question about explaining to the CEO or CFO how long it normally takes for an innovation cycle before it brings return, and what KPI you could set up for that. So, you know, I think the main thing is setting the expectations that innovation is, you know, a series of bets, right? And that's how venture capitalists and PE firms even do it. It's a series of bets. So the same returns that are often identified, we have a lot of research and recommendations around team metrics, but a lot of the metrics are not the same as like the traditional ROI metrics. So typically you have to, earlier I showed kind of these 3 cycles you need to go through. And that's why I recommended oftentimes you want to communicate results, not necessarily, you know, what the financial gain will be, because, for example, you'll have a series of customer problems that you're identifying, right? And then you're going to learn more out of that process. And so once you learn more, you might be able to tie a monetary value to it and how you can improve it. Then the next cycle, you're going to iterate and gain more around it. And then finally, you'll experiment around it. So it's really about setting new metrics around the number of good ideas you're bringing in, the number of experiments that are running, and getting the mindset shift that an experiment isn't necessarily right away going to have an ROI, but it is going to have these other KPIs that you can use as far as, you know, successful amount of experiments and so forth. But there is an element, especially the bigger innovation, you're just not going to have an ROI because you're going through these processes and experimenting and pivoting. Some of the incremental ones are easier, like whether they're cost savings or automations and things like that. But it is a mindset shift, and you're going to have to establish some of these KPIs on your own. And once you get some results, changing that mindset within the leadership team for what they're looking for. Here's a question about, are companies shifting their company mottos due to the pandemic to address different pain points for the customers? Yes, what a lot of companies we see are doing are scenario planning. So they're thinking through, obviously there's a current pain point that we all have, right? Then they're thinking through what are some of these behaviors that are going to, stick. Similar like they did to the shared economy back in the day. Some of those behavioral changes ended up becoming the new normal with, sharing, cars and homes and things like that. So they're looking at all the various scenarios. You could have 5, 6 different scenarios, and they're looking at all their products and services and how each of those scenarios can play out. So when you do that, then you can use innovation to run some of the experiments. So let's say you think the likelihood of having a hybrid model where people do keep the behavior where they stay home more often, but then we do go back to an element of being outside. Then if you think that's a high probability, then you can think through the whole life cycle of your product or service and think about, okay, what changes and what can we experiment and see, how do our products and services going to evolve? Many companies do see that things are going to change. And that behaviors are going to stick, and really making sure that they're in the driver's seat to figure out a proactive model versus just waiting and seeing in a reactive way what the market's going to do. Because depending on what the market does, if you're not prepared, it's going to take you a lot longer to adjust what's happening. Let's see. A lot of great questions. In a risk-averse, traditional, slow-motion, hybrid-cratic company, how do you foster the initial steps to innovation? I think this one is really, this question is around the courage and evangelism aspect. So you do need to share stories about what has happened, how people today are adjusting. We do a ton of case studies as far as how the different scenario planning people are doing. And really almost directly asking the question, are we looking to be operational and only survive the next 2-3 years, or are we looking to be around for the next 20 years? And sometimes having those point blank types of conversations, because in some companies, they might say, yes, we want to be innovative, but then, nothing that they're willing to invest in shows that. So I do think there is a need for a crucial type conversation at the leadership level to say, if we're serious about innovation, this is what we need to do. This is what other companies are doing. This is how other companies have responded. And, getting them to really take a good look at how long they really want to be in business. And, what are their motives and their goals. And then if they're serious about it, implementing and looking at some of the things that we covered today, because the trust factor is going to be huge too. So, people are not going to want to work for companies that say they want to be innovative, but then day in and day out, they're not doing anything to head to that direction. All of that's going to change. So I would definitely have those types of crucial conversations as far as, what do we want to do when we grow up? Why are we in business? Getting them out of the habit of thinking they sell a product or service and have really a more compelling why factor. Coming out of this, there are going to be a lot of winners and losers. That's really the bottom line. And the winners are going to be the ones that are able to pivot, as many have already done during the crisis, whether, they already had digital footprints. They didn't necessarily rely purely on a permanent retail footprint. Many companies pivoted. Instead of using, let's say, sales reps out in China, they quickly adopted and had been adopting before this happened the influencer model, so they weren't heavily relying on sales reps. So really looking at your overall even business model and thinking about things you can innovate. And so this is just going to accelerate everything. So the winners are going to be the ones that are continuously thinking about how they do it different. There's a question here that I'll share that I don't have the actual answer to, but I'll share some thoughts. We tend to see amazing success of startups that emerge and skyrocket quickly. We often ignore that many years a startup took before it found the right formula. Do we have any statistics on the average number of years before a startup finds its market and grows? Absolutely, the numbers are low. This is an outdated statistic, but way back, the odds of a startup failing or succeeding are very low, like 5–10%. And so that's why, and think about it too, like when we think about, we say we want to be innovative in a large company. When you compare it to the startup model, their entire being is to come up with, and they work in a very agile fashion. They're very quick, right? They don't have all the things we have in an enterprise, which is like the outdated KPIs, the organizational structures. They don't have all of these things that we often have, and their failure rate is really high. So when you think about when you try to innovate in a large company, if you're not changing any of your foundational mindsets, leadership, behaviors, processes, the odds of success are going to be even lower. And so, you can almost use them as an example about how serious you need to be innovative and how badly a lot of the processes need to shift and change. And the other thing that also brings up, many people think that, startups are going to be in trouble long term. I spoke with a client that thought that. And that's actually not true. Startups are going to slow down right now because of funding, but then they're going to accelerate. A lot of venture capital firms, a lot of the accelerators that I speak to, they're actually getting ready to invest even more in some of these startups. So, what I shared earlier about getting out of that habit that you have to create everything internally, it might be really a prime time for organizations to reinvent the way that they work for startups, because traditionally, legal, another perfect example, right? Legal is set up to manage risk within an organization. They're not necessarily of the mindset of how do we make this win-win so that we can partner with a startup, they can get traction and be successful, and we can solve our innovation problem. So a lot of times, I think what we're all faced with is how do we make one big ecosystem of shared intelligence, just like that's going on with COVID right now. We're seeing a lot of shared intelligence, right? People are offering up their organizations, they're pivoting their services. Competitors are teaming up with one another. Large organizations like Pfizer is partnering with some of the smaller startups. So really shifting about how can we enable startups and how can we enable ourselves and how can we break the habit of we have to create everything ourselves and own it ourselves, and instead creating this shared intelligence so that not only can startups be more successful, because oftentimes they fail because they don't have the same resources and traction that large companies do, and then large companies have a hard time innovating because it's a lot bigger ship to turn. So how do we take these complementing dynamics and work together to solve a bigger problem? So I think the ecosystem challenge will be something, a big shift that will come out of this as everybody realizes that we're in this together and we're all so connected, if that's anything that we all learn from this, right? And so how do we keep that connectedness and how do we create together so it's not an enterprise versus a startup and we can enable one another? I know that didn't answer the statistic question, but I do think that the future is set up to empower startups and empower corporations by being more nimble and having better legal processes as well to let startups in. I have a question here. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to answer a couple more. How would you bring the design thinking approach in the middle of a project when it started with Agile? it's hard for us to shift, and the team's not about ideation. One super simple, I'm going to try to kind of state it with the dynamics of where we are today, which is virtual. One thing you could do is kind of pause the project and say, you know, revisit the question. Sometimes when you revisit the question or the problem, it can bring to light what it is you're doing, right? Because sometimes teams will get laser focused on solving, let's say, a technology challenge, and you lose sight of what was the original problem that we're solving. So taking a pause in a simple fashion online and having teams look at, wait, what was the actual customer problem? How has this, and it can be simple, you don't need fancy tools or anything. If you have them, great, use them. If not, it can be as simple as, you know, a list, and having each person go off and think about, what did we say was the original problem? Does that problem exist? You can even bring in someone that has more insight and exposure to the actual problem. So if you want to pull in a business person that might have more visibility, or if you have a relationship with a customer that, you know, or access to a customer that you can pull in to validate, is this even the right problem anymore? And then you can just informally, you know, have the team on a call and just pause for an hour and say, where are we headed? Are we still headed in the right direction? And that actually is a great point to bring up, that you can continuously do that. So as major market changes happen, today it's a crisis, but tomorrow it might be something else, to constantly be aligned with what's going on around you and what's going on around the business, and having that, you know, pause in between, you know, moving to the next stage. And that's why that whole stage gate thing can become the stage gate light. Let me clarify, we don't want to put too much governance in place, but you want to have some governance to say, wait a minute, before I invest more into this experiment, is the problem still the same, and is the solution still viable? Whether it's a crisis or whether there's another market dynamic that's going on. So you can definitely even pause for an hour and ask that question. Let me see. Let's see the last question. There are a couple of questions in here about if this will be available, this presentation. It will be for sure to you guys. Collaboration tools for physical product prototyping. So if you're, a lot of the tools that I mentioned earlier for idea, two aspects. Idea generation has its own set of tools, which is the Bright Idea, the Idea Scale that I mentioned. And again, Gartner does in-depth analysis of both front-end innovation tools and back-end innovation tools. And on the back end, it's a lot around the agile process and the tools that are there. That hasn't really changed. But you know, the design thinking process, if you're going to do it physical, let's say we go to a hybrid model where some people stay virtual, some people will be physical. There are tools that you can use that are actually free. I have to look it up and get back to you what some of those are, or our product team that assesses those can get back to you. But you can illustrate physically, for example, the sticky board process when you do design thinking. There's virtual tools that will enable that. And so you could start looking at what the hybrid will look like, because even within innovation, most likely we're not going to go back to exactly what we were doing before. So it's really important to think about, you know, what the innovation process will look like in a potential hybrid world. The other real big benefit to that mindset shift is that when we sometimes create products and services, we get very focused on, we lose sight of who our real customer is. And I'll give you an example. I used to be in automotive, and we were laser focused on the current customer, and we lost sight that, you know, one of the biggest influencers in making a decision to purchase a car is actually women. And so we didn't even have women included in our design thinking process and in our process of the creation. And so what's happened now, you have access now to people globally. And so it's important to engage other people outside of your own echo chamber when you are figuring out solutions to problems, and get people more involved that are all around the world that could be your potential customer that is having the problem that you're trying to solve. So it's important to keep that physical and virtual aspect and leverage what we've all seen work in this big experiment. All right, and I think we're out of time, so I'll turn it back over to you, Danielle.
We are exactly at time. Thank you, Michelle. Those are a lot of great questions and a lot to answer, so I'm sure everyone really appreciates that. Just a quick reminder to our audience, you can download the research and other resources from the Attachments tab. Also, please rate the presentation if you haven't already done so. So I'd like to thank our presenter, Michelle, again, and of course, thank you all for listening. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you.